They tried to remove him quietly. No announcement, no explanation, just a whispered command passed down the line. Step aside, you're relieved. But Sergeant Rowan Hale didn't move, because nothing was wrong, and he'd seen what happened in combat zones when you obey orders that don't make sense. So he stood his ground, until two palace aides began walking toward him, until they reached for his arm, and that's when it happened. Princess Charlotte stepped forward, walked down the stairs, alone, and stood directly in front of the guard. Her words, not shouted, not rehearsed. Just two words. He stays. Before I show you what happened next, and how those two words flipped the entire courtyard upside down, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Because this wasn't a scandal, this wasn't a mistake. This was a child rewriting royal tradition in front of the entire world. Windsor Castle wore late summer like an old coat. Comfortable, familiar, golden at the edges where afternoon light pooled against stone that had witnessed 800 years of English history. The forecourt stretched wide and clean beneath a cloudless sky, transformed into something that belonged on postcards. Polished brass railings catching sunlight, velvet rope lines holding back eager crowds, white-gloved musicians tuning instruments in the shade of canvas awnings. To the tourists packed 3 deep behind the barriers, it was magic made real. American families clutched folding Union Jacks and guidebooks thick with post-it notes. German couples adjusted telephoto lenses with the focus of battlefield surgeons. A Japanese broadcast crew had claimed the prime corner spot and showed no signs of moving until the last note faded. All of them leaning forward, squinting into the soft light, waiting for their first glimpse of actual royalty. None of them noticed the man in scarlet who was already watching them back. Sergeant Rowan Hale stood 32 paces from the raised platform, second from centre in the Coldstream Guards formation. 6'2" in his boots, perfectly postured beneath the towering bearskin that cast his face in shadow. His scarlet tunic caught the afternoon light like flame, and his SA-80 rifle rested against his shoulder with parade-ground precision. But his eyes were never still. At 36, Hale carried the kind of alertness that came from places where paying attention meant the difference between coming home and not coming home. 2 tours in Helmand had given him those eyes. The survival habit of reading crowds, measuring distances, cataloguing the small details that separated normal behaviour from potential threat. The scar tissue on his left shoulder still pulled tight when the weather changed. A permanent reminder of the roadside bomb that had ended his combat deployments and brought him here, to the ceremonial heart of Britain. Some of his mates saw this posting as a step down from real soldiering. Hale understood it differently. The threat environment had changed, not disappeared. Standing guard in the centre of London required a different kind of vigilance, but it was still vigilance. Right now, that old alertness was starting to whisper warnings. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies that his training had taught him to notice. A junior aide near the royal platform was pacing in tight circles, the kind of nervous energy that didn't match the calm dignity these events were built on. A security man at the garden wall kept touching his earpiece, checking and rechecking like he was expecting orders that hadn't come yet, and clustered near the south corner of the rope line were more press cameras than usual, all properly accredited, but positioned with the kind of intention that suggested they knew something was going to happen. Hale didn't move, didn't shift his weight or break formation, but his mind filed each detail in quiet sequence. He'd stood ceremonial guard for diplomats and presidents, prime ministers, and foreign royalty. Even the Pope once, during that tense visit when half of London had been locked down. The rhythm of these occasions was burned into his bones. The precise timing, the careful choreography, the way minutes stretched in the stillness between drum beats. You didn't have to move to see everything, and sometimes the most important thing a soldier could do was notice what didn't belong. The music struck up from behind the archway, a cascade of brass that seemed to rise from the stones themselves. Near the royal platform, camera shutters began clicking in rapid bursts. The afternoon's main event was about to begin. Hale remained motionless at his post, rifle cradled with ceremonial perfection. But something in his chest had started ticking like a countdown timer. This day wasn't going to follow the script. The trouble started with a whisper. It began near the royal platform. A lean between two men in dark suits, clipboard tucked under one arm, voices too low to carry but urgent enough to matter. A quick nod, a glance toward the guard formation. Then the second man turned and began walking along the rear of the platform with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested borrowed authority. From his position 30 paces away, Sergeant Hale tracked it all without moving his head an inch. He'd seen this pattern before, in dusty compounds outside Lashkar Gah, where the wrong message could collapse an entire operation. Instructions that didn't follow proper channels. Orders that weren't quite orders. The kind of communication that happened when someone wanted plausible deniability later. It took maybe 90 seconds for the message to work its way down the chain, whispered through earpieces, nodded across shoulders, passed between security personnel like a game of telephone played in expensive suits. Finally, it reached the royal liaison standing just off Hale's left flank. The man didn't look like much. Clean-shaven, anonymous face, black suit that could have come from any department store. But when he stepped forward and spoke just loud enough for Hale to hear, his voice carried the weight of institutional backing. "You're being rotated out, Sergeant. Step back." Hale didn't respond immediately. Not out of defiance, just caution. His breathing remained at parade rhythm, one inhale every 8 seconds, eyes fixed straight ahead. But internally, every alarm he'd learned to trust in Afghanistan was starting to sound. "Orders from above," the liaison added, when the silence stretched too long. "Don't make this difficult." That's when Hale knew for certain something was wrong. There was no rotation schedule mid-ceremony. No precedent for relieving a Coldstream Guard during active royal display baton, not unless there was a medical emergency, a security breach, or direct orders from a superior officer. None of which applied here. He wasn't swaying, he wasn't sick, and he damn sure wasn't seeing any superior officers. More importantly, he'd spent 12 years learning to separate real authority from people who just sounded authoritative. Taliban fighters used to pose as friendlies to draw British soldiers out of defensive positions. You survived that kind of environment by learning to verify before you trusted. His instinct said this was wrong. His training said to wait for proper protocol. "Sir," Hale said finally, voice quiet but steady, "ceremonial relief requires written orders or direct handover from a superior officer." The liaison's jaw tightened. "It's been cleared through internal command." "Then the paperwork will follow," Hale replied, still unmoving. A pause, the kind of silence that builds before someone decides whether to escalate or retreat. Then the man stepped back. Not all the way, just enough to whisper into his cuff mic without being overheard. Hale caught fragments. Not cooperating, waiting on secondary authorization. That was all he needed to know. This wasn't about ceremony or security. Someone wanted him gone from that post, and they weren't willing to follow proper channels to make it happen. Which meant either they couldn't follow proper channels, or they didn't want to leave a paper trail. Neither possibility suggested good intentions. Hale had buried enough friends by trusting voices that didn't belong. Until someone with actual authority, visible authority, stepped forward to relieve him, he wasn't moving. Not for whispers, not for institutional pressure, not for anyone. He'd hold the line until it killed him if necessary. That was what being a guard meant. From the raised platform, Princess Charlotte saw it all unfold. She wasn't supposed to be watching. The entire afternoon had been choreographed down to the minute, from her seating position to the angle of her chin when cameras panned across the royal enclosure. 2 different palace communication staff had briefed her that morning about expectations. Sit straight, don't fidget, don't speak unless spoken to. Remember that every movement will be photographed and analysed. She understood the performance better than most adults. At 10 years old, she'd already learned how to keep her face composed when something went wrong, how to smile on command, how to exist under scrutiny without showing the weight of it. So when she noticed the exchange near the guard formation, 2 aides talking to Sergeant Hale with increasing urgency while he remained perfectly still, she didn't react outwardly. Her posture stayed royal perfect, hands folded in her lap, but her eyes tracked every detail. She knew that guard, not his name or his story, but his face. Turs. She'd seen him before, lining courtyards during state visits, posted near the chapel during family services. He never smiled during ceremonies, never looked anywhere except where he was supposed to look. Always held his position, like it meant something more than just standing there. He was one of the reliable ones. Even at 10, she could tell the difference. Beside her, Prince William was deep in conversation with the Japanese cultural attaché, his tone graciously diplomatic. To his left, Queen Camilla adjusted the brooch on her lapel and smiled at the cameras with practiced precision. Neither of them had noticed the quiet confrontation happening 30 yards away, but Charlotte saw everything. The way the aides moved closer to the guard, the way he didn't budge, the increasingly sharp gestures that suggested they weren't asking anymore, they were demanding. And she saw something else too. The look on Sergeant Hale's face wasn't fear or defiance. It was awareness, the same expression she'd learned to recognize in adults who were being pressured to do something they knew was wrong. Her stomach tightened with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not danger. This wasn't bombs or protests or the kind of threats that brought armed response teams. This was something quieter and somehow worse. The feeling of watching someone be treated unfairly while everyone else looked the other way. For just a moment, Sergeant Hale's eyes swept across the platform. Their gazes met for a fraction of a second. Neither of them smiled or nodded, but something passed between them. Understanding. Recognition. Charlotte had seen adults use their authority to push people around before. She'd watched quiet cruelties hidden behind polite words and diplomatic smiles. And she'd learned what happened when someone tried to resist. They usually ended up standing alone, but maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to. The aides weren't walking fast, but they were walking with purpose. The kind of slow, confident movement that came from institutional backing and the assumption that resistance was temporary. 3 men in expensive suits approached Sergeant Hale's position like they owned the ground beneath his boots, which, in their minds, they probably did. Palace staff. Internal command. The machinery that kept royal life running smoothly behind the scenes. They'd handled difficult situations before. Uncooperative vendors, pushy reporters, security contractors who didn't understand their place in the hierarchy. A ceremonial guard refusing to follow simple instructions shouldn't have been particularly challenging. The crowd hadn't noticed yet. Most eyes were still focused on the music, the pageantry, the distant figures on the royal platform. A few tourists caught the movement near the rope line and tilted their phones for a better angle, but nothing more. The lead aide, tall, silver-haired, carrying a clipboard like a weapon, came to a stop directly in front of Hale, close enough for private conversation, close enough to make his point without creating a public scene. "Sergeant," he said, voice clipped with the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. "You've been relieved. Step aside. No rank, no identification, no uniform to back the order." Hale's response was measured and calm. "Ceremonial protocol requires written orders or relief by a superior officer, sir, which neither you nor your colleagues appear to be." The aide's mouth tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone he considered decorative. "This comes directly from Her Majesty's domestic office. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." But Hale had heard that line before, in places where making things difficult was often the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. He'd learned to distinguish between real authority and people who just sounded like they had authority. "I'll stand down when proper protocol is followed," he said even, "not before." The second aide stepped forward, irritation bleeding through his professional demeanour. "We can make this official right here, right now." "Is that what you want?" Hale's reply was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 12 years in uniform. "Do it." The challenge hung in the air between them, because they couldn't, not without breaking their own rules. Not without creating the kind of public disruption that would require explanation. Not without revealing that their real authority was much less solid than their confidence suggested. They'd expected compliance. They'd gotten a soldier who knew regulations better than they did. And they were about to discover that someone else had been watching the entire exchange. Princess Charlotte was already moving. She'd risen from her seat during the aide's second attempt at intimidation, her movement so subtle that even the photographers tracking the royal platform missed it initially. By the time anyone noticed, she was already halfway down the stone steps. Her powder blue coat caught the afternoon breeze as she walked across the forecourt with the kind of deliberate calm that drew every eye in the vicinity. She didn't look at the crowd pressing against the barriers. She didn't check with her father or grandmother. She didn't pause to consider the protocols she was about to shatter. She simply walked toward the confrontation with the quiet determination of someone who'd decided that watching wasn't enough anymore. The gasps started small, a ripple from the nearest rope line, then spreading outward as people realized what they were seeing. A child, a princess, moving with purpose toward a situation that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with power. By the time she reached Sergeant Hale's position, the entire forecourt had gone silent, not the respectful quiet of formal occasions, but the electric stillness that comes when everyone realizes they're about to witness something unprecedented. Charlotte came to a stop directly in front of the three aides. Small frame, perfectly composed, chin lifted not in arrogance, but in something older and quieter, certainty. She didn't look at Sergeant Hale, she looked at the men who'd been trying to remove him. And then she spoke. He stays. 2 words, clear, controlled, unmistakable. The silence deepened until you could hear shutters clicking from 50 yards away. The lead aide's mouth opened slightly, then closed. No protocol existed for this moment. No manual covered what to do when a 10-year-old princess issued counter orders in full view of international media. One of the photographers near the rope line whispered, "Jesus Christ!" without realizing his microphone was still hot. Charlotte didn't move, didn't elaborate, didn't explain herself. She simply stood there, between the aides and the guard, making her position unmistakably clear. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't rebellion, it was something more fundamental. Protection. She'd seen someone being treated unfairly, and she'd stepped in to stop it. The aides looked toward each other, then back at the platform where Queen Camilla had begun to rise from her seat, her expression hardening as she processed what was happening. But Charlotte didn't look back. She'd made her choice, and now she was holding the line. Behind her, Sergeant Hale remained at perfect attention, but something in his chest had loosened, the tension of standing alone against institutional pressure. He was still a soldier, still at his post, but now he wasn't the only one willing to hold it. The crowd was beginning to understand that they weren't watching ceremony anymore. They were watching history being written in real time by the smallest person in the forecourt. Queen Camilla's voice cut across the courtyard like a blade. She'd risen from her seat with the kind of controlled fury that powerful people display when their authority is challenged in public. Her eyes locked onto Charlotte's back with laser focus. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades spent navigating palace intrigue. Remove them both. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words dropped into the silence with the finality of a gavel, sharp and clear enough to reach every microphone in the vicinity. The tension that followed was electric. 3 security officers along the platform's edge shifted position, not toward Camilla, but toward Charlotte and Hale. The unspoken order had moved past ceremony into operational territory. But something unexpected happened. No one moved. The musicians stood frozen, instruments still raised mid-phrase. The aides didn't take another step forward. Even the royal protection detail, trained to respond to commands without hesitation, remained in place. Because standing between them and their objective was a 10-year-old girl, not crying, not making a scene, not throwing a tantrum or demanding attention, just standing, calm, resolute. Charlotte's hands remained clasped at her sides. Her expression was unreadable, not blank, but held with the kind of control that comes from growing up in public. Behind that careful composure was something that gave even seasoned security professionals pause, absolute certainty that she was doing the right thing. She wasn't performing for cameras. She wasn't trying to challenge the monarchy or make a statement about power. She was simply protecting someone who didn't deserve to be pushed around, and every lens in the forecourt was capturing it. Behind her, Sergeant Hale felt the weight of the moment settling around them like armour. This wasn't Afghanistan. There were no bullets or roadside bombs. But it was still a battle, quiet, bloodless, but no less real. And somehow, inexplicably, he was no longer fighting it alone. The aides exchanged desperate glances. One reached for the radio clipped inside his jacket, hesitated, then let his hand drop. Even they understood the optics. No one forcibly removes a princess from a public ceremony. Not in front of tourists, not in front of international press, and certainly not when she's protecting a guard who hasn't broken a single regulation. Camilla's jaw tightened as she realized her command wasn't being followed. Her voice came again, sharper this time. "I said, remove them!" But the security officers remained frozen. They were trained to follow orders, but they were also trained to think tactically. And the tactical reality was simple. Laying hands on Princess Charlotte would create a scandal that would dominate headlines for months. More importantly, it would require them to physically move a child who was clearly acting from conscience, not rebellion. The entire forecourt remained locked in suspension, centuries of royal authority pressing against one small girl's refusal to step aside. And then Prince William moved. He'd been watching the confrontation unfold with growing understanding, piecing together what had happened and why. The aide's aggressive posture, his daughter's protective stance, the guard who'd refused to be bullied from his post. Now he rose from his chair and walked down the stone steps with the measured pace of someone who'd reached a decision. His approach wasn't hurried or angry, it was simply final. He came to a stop beside Charlotte, his shadow joining hers on the ancient cobblestones. "What's going on?" he asked quietly, his voice intended only for her and Hale. Charlotte turned slightly without moving from her position. They were trying to make him leave for no reason. William's eyes moved to Sergeant Hale for the first time. The guard's face remained perfectly composed, but something passed between the two men. Not a salute or formal acknowledgement, just understanding. The recognition of someone doing his job properly under difficult circumstances. William looked back at his daughter, and something in his expression shifted. Pride, maybe, or just the recognition that she'd inherited something important. "Guards protect us," Charlotte added simply, "so I'm protecting him." The words hit harder than any speech could have. They cut through protocol and politics to something more fundamental, the basic human obligation to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. Prince William turned toward the aides, who suddenly looked very small and very exposed. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the forecourt. "He stays!" 2 words, the same ones his daughter had used. But coming from the heir to the throne, they carried the weight of absolute authority. The confrontation was over. The aides didn't argue or protest. They simply turned and walked back toward the platform, their expensive suits looking rumpled despite the afternoon heat. One kept his clipboard pressed against his chest like body armour. The other stared at the ground as they retreated. William placed a gentle hand on Charlotte's shoulder. "You can come back up now," he murmured. "You made your point." But Charlotte lingered for one more moment. She looked up at Sergeant Hale, not with a child's hero worship, but with something deeper. Recognition. The acknowledgement between two people who understood what it meant to hold the line when everyone else wanted you to give up. Then she turned and climbed the stairs back to the royal platform, leaving the guard exactly where he belonged. And Sergeant Rowan Hale, still standing at perfect attention, watched her go with something approaching awe. Because in 12 years of military service, through 2 combat deployments and countless ceremonies, he'd never seen courage quite like that. Quiet, unshakable, 10 years old. The kind of courage that didn't need to announce itself. It just stood its ground and dared the world to move it. The ceremony resumed, with the awkward rhythm of a machine remembering how to function after an unexpected shutdown. The band picked up their interrupted march, brass instruments gleaming in the afternoon sun. Officials resumed their positions. Cameras slowly panned back toward the royal platform, where normal pageantry was supposed to be happening. But normal had left the building. Everyone in that forecourt, from the tourists pressed against the barriers to the seasoned reporters with their telephoto lenses, knew they'd witnessed something that would be talked about for decades. Not just because a princess had broken protocol, but because she'd done it for all the right reasons. Word spread through the crowd in whispers and pointed glances. Not excitement or scandal, but recognition. The kind of collective understanding that comes when people realise they've seen true character in action. Sergeant Hale remained at his post, rifle cradled with parade ground precision. To outside observers, nothing about his stance had changed, but inside everything was different. The weight of standing alone against institutional pressure had lifted. He was still a soldier, still holding the line, but now he knew that someone had been watching. Someone had cared enough to act when action mattered. Around the forecourt, other guards noticed the shift too. They didn't turn their heads or break formation. That wasn't their way. But Johnson, from the third position, caught his eye for a fraction of a second and gave the smallest possible nod. Davies, from the rear guard, adjusted his grip on his rifle in a way that somehow conveyed approval. They understood. In their own quiet way, they were telling him he'd done the right thing, that they would have done the same. More subtle changes were already beginning. The Royal Protection Command had quietly repositioned their personnel, where before their focus had been entirely on external threats, protesters, unauthorized access, crowd control. Now their attention included internal dynamics. 2 plainclothes officers remained near the ceremonial area, not as participants, but as observers. The message was clear. Someone higher up the chain had made a decision about what kind of behaviour would be tolerated going forward. Behind the barriers, conversations buzzed in multiple languages as tourists processed what they'd witnessed. An elderly German woman kept wiping her eyes and saying something to her husband that sounded approving. A group of American teenagers were frantically typing on their phones, trying to capture what had happened in social media posts that would never quite convey the real weight of the moment. A BBC correspondent standing near the media section lowered her microphone and just watched for a moment. Later, she would struggle to find the right words for her report. How do you explain that sometimes the most important news isn't about policy or politics, but about a child who decided that fairness mattered more than rules? On the platform, Charlotte sat beside her father with the same composed dignity she'd shown all afternoon. Her back was straight, her hands properly folded. To viewers watching on television, she looked like any royal child at any ceremonial event, but twice during the remaining ceremony, she glanced over her shoulder towards Sergeant Hale's position. Not checking on him, he clearly didn't need checking on. Just acknowledging, in her quiet way, that some connections transcend protocol. The second time she offered the smallest possible nod, a soldier's nod, the kind that says, message received, understood, and filed away for future reference. Hale didn't return the gesture. That wouldn't have been appropriate. But something in his jaw relaxed, and his breathing settled into the easy rhythm of someone who no longer had to carry the weight of standing alone. When the final notes faded and the ceremony officially concluded, the crowd began to disperse with the usual mixture of satisfaction and lingering excitement. They'd gotten their photographs and their memories. Most would go home happy with their glimpse of royal tradition. But some would go home with something more, the knowledge that they'd seen something rare and important. The kind of moment that restores faith in the idea that courage still exists, that standing up for what's right still matters, that sometimes the smallest person in the room can be the most powerful. As the platforms emptied and the ceremonial equipment was packed away, Sergeant Hale finally allowed himself a moment of reflection. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that the hardest battles weren't always the loudest ones. Sometimes they were fought in silence, with nothing but conviction, and the hope that someone, somewhere would notice when you refused to give up ground that shouldn't be surrendered. Today, someone had noticed. Someone had stepped forward when stepping forward mattered. And now, because of that, every guard in the British Army knew that holding the line wasn't a solitary duty anymore. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you got backup from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, that backup was 10 years old and absolutely fearless. The kind of fearless that changes everything. What would you have done if you'd seen what Princess Charlotte saw that afternoon? Do you think there are moments when a child's sense of right and wrong is clearer than all the adult politics and protocol? And how many other people are standing their ground somewhere right now, waiting for someone to notice that they shouldn't have to stand alone? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you think Charlotte made the right choice. If this story reminds you why quiet courage matters, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because moments like this deserve to be shared. Pass this along to someone who needs to remember that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear powder blue coats and refuse to let good people get pushed around. Your next story is waiting. Click it now, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that the most important battles are usually the quietest ones.